And it was before the day of the combine when Dad caught his leg in the I think it was a binder and broke his leg, and
I don't know about that.
you don't remember it.
The only similar thing I can think of is Jess
Yes, Jess Moore.
Moore caught his coat or his shirt in the flywheel of the machine.
Yes, but this was Dad
Yeah.
on the range.
No, I don't remember that. But the two, I'm thinking of now associating grain with these two young Japanese Americans. And I remember them shoveling. Remember those long white buildings that were used for lambing sheds and so forth? One of them was there at the South Two Dog. And the granary could be accessed through holes in the roof. The building was up against a bank, so you could drive a pickup or a truck right up to close to the roof and take a cover of this open and shovel straight into the granary through the roof. And these two young men, using, I think they were called number 12 shovels to pitch grain. And I've always had this feeling of admiration because I've tried to shovel grain myself. And I've done a lot of it, but I'll tell you that when you talk about back breaking, literally, that is really tough work. I've always thought about that. Excuse me. What else about this? One other thing I used to talk about your brother Mac, two ways. Can I?
Yeah, I want you to.
Okay. Having to do with grain. When Mac came back from the war, he spent a lot of time in town, so he wasn't getting a lot of sleep. So during some of that time, he drove the grain truck. And so when the combine would make its rounds, eventually the hopper was full, and it was time for him to drive the truck over, and they'd empty the hopper into the truck. In between times, he'd go to sleep in the cab. I remember one of the things was he stayed in the bunkhouse the same as we. And one day, evening, we short-sheeted his bed. We knew he was going to come in the wee hours. And I was forever disappointed because he never said anything about it. So, there's nothing more disappointing than to play a trick on somebody and then have nothing come of it. The other thing is that, in a way, it had a portent that seems tragic. Below the lower Tudot, it had gotten marshy and bad. And it decided that there should be some drainage created, a ditch. It's normally done with a shovel or a big steam shovel or a drag line. But because it was a lot of water, Mac hit on the idea of doing it with dynamite. And so I was only peripherally a part of this. He took the dynamite and every so often he traced a pathway for this drainage dish, and every so often he'd put a stick of dynamite. And then finally he put a stick of dynamite with a cap and a fuse. And then we went up on the hill and he shot this off. The first, of course, went with the fuse. The rest of them were detonated by the shock through the water. And it was a beautiful show because it created this beautiful, it's almost like an Old Faithful. Of course, it was very dirty one. So that was part of our exposure to dynamite. And that, of course, eventually was one of the things that was the thing that caused Charlie to lose his hand. I don't mean to draw a direct connection, but I think in a way it may have had an indirect connection because it gave Charlie the feeling that he knew something about
Yes.
how to handle dynamite.
Overconfident. Tell us about it. You were there when Charlie had his accident. Tell us about it from your angle.
Well, it was a rainy day. On a ranch, a rainy day means you can't put up hay, you can't brand. There wouldn't have been any branding in any case, but rain is always a time to do odd jobs. Clean up in the barn, clean up around the sheds, and that kind of thing. And so Mac was the foreman, and so he had the task of giving everybody something to do to keep them busy. It was an old log building, still standing, not a very long ways away from the house. If you remember, there was some new buildings built that looked a little bit like what we call carports. Remember that?
Yes.
Where all that
Sheds.
old machine, all of those machine tools were built. So in front, and near the first one of those, was this old log building. Don't know what it was ever original, but it was used in the upper two dot for storing grain. So among the things that Mac decided ought to be done was to muck out this old building in those places where there wasn't grain. Well, we found about a half a box had a what's it called? Cap, dynamite cap, which were cased in copper. I was close by and was at his side while the dust was still settling. It had blown a lot of his clothes off. As you know, he blew his hand off completely from about an inch from his wrist, on the hand side of his wrist. So that all of his fingers were gone, but the wrist joint was still there. I mention that simply because when we went to Doc Williams, he then finished the job by making it possible for him to retain movement of that joint. Anyway, the skin was split down the length of his forearm, and all of the tendons and everything were down on that. And so I took my shirt off and wrapped my shirt around his arm. Janet's called Cody. And because it had been raining, we never knew what to expect. She arranged for somebody to be at...
Wasn't the road being worked on?
No. But she arranged for somebody to be at Cottonwood Creek, because that was a bridge that sometimes washed out. So I know it sounds, so I can remember clearly. Mac driving, Charlie was sitting in between us, no idea to laying him down to worry about shock or anything like that. But I sat beside Charlie and we drove into town. And I remember seeing that car waiting. There's really no reason to get. Anyway, we drove down Main Street, Mac Hinckley and so forth. Doc Williams was there. And I remember as he was working, give Charlie some kind of medication, including saline drip and so on, to deal with shock. He was working on what was left in his hand. And during that time, he talked to us about the tanks of gas, oxygen, and anesthetic and so forth, the kinds of valves that we're using. But he really knew his stuff. But really, that was all there was to it. Charlie never lost consciousness. His his body was as if he'd been caught in a shrapnel blast. It was his leg, his chest were covered with gravel. And then, of course, he lost the hand. He lost much of his hearing. And he had significant damage to both eyes.
Wasn't his skin covered with that blue powder mark too?
I don't remember that. We had been shooting prairie dogs a few days before that, Charlie and I. To modern tree huggers and people with a lot of little furry things would think that we were cruel beasts. And we did a lot of that. And generally you think, because they're quick and they get into their holes in a herd, we have to stop. The tape is over.
Oh. I think this has been a very valuable thing. I'm so pleased we're getting it.
That microphone is designed to receive over a 120 degree angle. So it's less than ideal, but
We're pretty nice.
here's what we have.
Yes. Okay, we finished Charlie.
Yeah, with respect to Charlie's accident, of course the word went out that they were looking for nurses because it looked like he would require 24-hour attention. And so I later found out that it went up into Yellowstone Park, and the rumor had gone around that there'd been some kind of a terrible accident, like a bus or a train
yes.
or something, and that the number
Involving
of
lots
people
of people.
Okay. No, here's what I was going to tell you. We were shooting prairie dogs, and what you tried to do, if you didn't shoot the prairie dog in the head, he'd quickly disappear down his hole. In other words, if his death was not instantaneous, you had no way of knowing for sure if you actually hit the animal. And only 3 or 4 days before this, I'd shot a prairie dog, and it sounds terrible describing it, but the front of the animal's face was shot away, but it was still alive. And I told Charlie, I said, don't worry about the animal. I said, my understanding is that the body reaches a certain threshold of pain, and at that point it can no longer feel any greater or more intense pain. And as we rode into town in the pickup, immediately after his accident, he thought about that, and he said, Scott, I wish that would apply to me, that somehow there would be less pain.
Mm-hmm.